Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this final session. I was told you've had 2 days of very intense discussions about all things digital and the digital divide and accessibility and affordability and all kinds of issues which this panel is very well versed to address. And I was told that the mission for me is to sort of try and draw those threads together into a session where we can really think through some of those issues and crystallize the issues. I was wondering why I was asked to do that. And when my friend Rosa asked me to do it some time ago, I sort of readily agreed without quite knowing what I had got myself into. I suppose it must be because the media has been massively disrupted by things digital. You all know about the drift of audiences online, and our challenge over the last few years has really been to transform our newsroom from a pure print product into one which is completely multimedia. So we've had to retrain our staff, we've had to fashion the way we think about content, and these days we put out content not just once a day, but throughout the day, on our website, on our apps, on our newsletters, through events like these, through books, through our radio station. And it's just been a complete rethinking of the way we operate. The hours we work, the times we hold our meetings, the speed with which we respond to news events. And you could look at it two ways. If you were the kind of person who saw the glass half empty, you might say, this isn't so much fun. But I'm more of a glass half full kind of guy, and I see it as a tremendous opportunity because instead of having just one point of contact with my audience each day, I have multiple points of contact with them throughout the day, and many, many ways to send content to them in ways and forms that they find engaging, and hopefully to hold on to their attention for longer. And so I see that as a great plus. And I think the same sorts of issues apply to all of us in this room working with cultural content as well, and grappling with the technological changes, as well as the societal changes that are taking place all around us. And this panel, I think you've all met them over the course of the last 2 days, so I won't spend time introducing them and reading their CVs to you. Just to give you a feel, we've got a good mix of people on the panel. I'm going to call them just by first name. Michael tells me he's a media researcher and artist. Sarah says she's a hybrid between a professor and a curator and a museum worker, in her own words. Debbie is an artist and a technologist. And Yvonne is assistant director of the Esplanade in Singapore, and Kirk Siang is a researcher with our own heritage board. So a very good mix of experiences to get into the discussion. And I thought I would sort of start by crystallizing the issue with a simple personal example. And this relates to my own experience as a lover of classical music. And not so long ago, I became a paying subscriber to the Berlin Philharmonic's digital concert hall. And for me as a user, that was great. I instantly had access to the concert hall. I could wander around all over the place, backstage, front stage, virtually. I could go into their archives and listen to recordings that had been done by von Karajan and his predecessors, and Simon Rattle and his predecessors. I could watch live streaming of their concerts. So it was wonderful. But I also paused to ask myself, what does this do to the Berlin Philharmonic? What does it do to its revenues in terms of CD sales? And what does it do to their audience? Are people more inclined to visit Berlin? If you live in this part of the world, not that many opportunities to go flying off to Berlin to experience a concert. But the flip side is that having experienced a digital concert, I want to go all the more, to Berlin to experience one of those concerts. So is that audience growing or diminishing as a result of it? And if you are the conductor of that orchestra, Simon Rattle, and for now anyway. How does that change the role of the conductor? I mean, you may be a fabulous conductor, understanding the music and knowing its history and the background, but if you suddenly become the person who's at the head of an organization that's also having to broadcast digitally around the world, does it change the nature of your role? Does it change the nature of the kind of person that needs to play that role? Someone who understands not just music, but technology. Finding someone like Sarah who understands both and is comfortable with both, I think it's not so easy in any circumstance. And if you are the conductor or musical director of such an organization, do you program for the local audience, or do you program for a global audience? And the pros and cons both ways. If you start programming for the Berlin Philharmonic for a global audience, what does that do to your core mission of being the repository of the Western canon? So there are big issues that we can get into, and I thought I'd just crystallize it with that personal example, but I think we can go much deeper into those issues, drawing on the experiences from the members of the panel. And we've decided, collectively, that Michael will start, and they'll each take about 10, 15 minutes to go into some of these issues, and then we will get into a discussion and we'll take questions from all of you as well. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Warren. And I'm going to be shorter because I spoke so much yesterday. And the other thing is I want to thank all of you because one of the great values of presenting to audiences like this is to learn. So what I'm going to do is very briefly take what I think are four very, very basic ideas and provocations that I kind of came here with and crystallize them a little based on the wonderful feedback and conversations that I've had. So again, this is going to be brief, and I'm going to first try to do it without slides, and then just do some very, very quick supporting slides. The first is that the tech industry, the tool makers have been long dominated by mostly young, mostly male, mostly privileged, and virtually all engineers, and that we're at an extraordinary, I think, point of openness, frankly, because of what happened with the US presidential election. The second point is that the role of the arts community and doing art projects as something symbiotic with tool making and the tech community is opportune, and there's evidence of that. I'll give you some specific examples. The third is that for you in particular, in the cultural institution world, the area of saving cultural extinction seems to me to be one of the safest and most critical issues, and again, opportune. And the fourth, now that you know me, is a little thing about virtual reality, and that because that's so new and so exciting right now, that might also be a little bit of a tabula rasa to do some of these things. So can we switch to, let's see, you know what? Yeah, okay, but I also want to get rid of, do some editing. Okay, I won't, it's, okay.
Yeah, let me do it.
Okay. Thank you. You gotta love her. Good, okay.
Next slide.
Yes.
That one?
This one. That'll do. Okay. Thank you. We're sharing computers, and it's not mine. Okay. So this is a quote from a historian of millennial kind of multi-millennial kind of historian on the history of Homo sapiens. And this was from before the election, note the date. In actuality, the most crucial choices about the future of ordinary voters and their children are probably made not by Brussels bureaucrats or Washington lobbyists, but by engineers, entrepreneurs, and scientists who are hardly aware of the implications of their decisions and who certainly don't represent anyone. I doubt whether the gurus of Silicon Valley have really thought through the full social and political consequences of their ideas, but at least they are thinking in fresh ways. When humans lose the ability to make sense of rapid global change and the old story collapses and leaves a void, we need new ways of thinking, and we need them fast. And again, I can't underemphasize that since the election, as a Californian, watching the reflection and kind of the freaked outedness, that so many people are having, particularly in Silicon Valley, and a very large amount of direct and indirect soul searching. The issue of fake news and whatnot, and that maybe we need more than engineers, talented, wonderful engineers, in the mix to get this very, very powerful stuff right. Okay, number 2, this is actually a bottom-up list that I put together several years ago based on having the good fortune to have been the artist or unartist in several research labs. So again, forgive me, but I'm reading because I want to be very basic on this stuff and provocative for questions and discussion later. How art projects can be useful, add value in research and tech settings. Number 1, they can provide stimulation and provocation to our research community, adding meaning, entertainment, and emotional resonance to our work. Number 2, these projects often act as magnets to bring together unconventional combinations of skills and talents. 3, they can provide content to test tools, and sometimes the other way around, tools to test content. Some of these projects are means for collecting data about human behavior, both through explicit query as well as through observation. We heard a lot of this over the past couple days. These projects may lead researchers down unforeseen paths and result in new discoveries in intellectual property. And finally, external deadlines and public scrutiny serve as forcing functions for decision-making, rigor, and completion. They keep us, meaning the research, the tech community, street smart. Putting on a show is a test bed for new ideas, a simulation of the real world. Okay, number 3, and these were just some of the words and phrases that I've heard over the past couple days and that I've kind of pondered. So nothing more than just show these for reflection. That again, the idea of cultural extinction, and that to me means an urgency and on a global level. And maybe I'm being a little too Californian, but the groundedness as opposed to being skybound as being a complementary thing is, I think, legitimate. This, some of you may remember, is from a slide yesterday of the 1920s, and ethnomusicologist John Lomax and his teenage son Alan driving around recording the very first field recordings of song ever, because what's in the back of this car is a recording machine given to them by Thomas Edison's widow and made portable. But this is the kind of stuff that I hope you all do. And of course, we don't need 500 pounds in the back of a car to do this. We can do this with stuff in our pockets, and it's relatively accessible and fast. And to do it on a global scale. Start local, of course, but when we think about this globally, Sarah asked yesterday about interconnecting metadatabases and how important that is and how rich that is for everyone to be able to move from one place and to get this idea, and I would add appreciation of the world as a whole. Now, don't laugh. It's not as bad as it looks. This is probably going to happen. It's probably going to happen because the only way to get the sort of what we would call wide-angle, ortho-stereo, head-tracked, high-resolution experience in your home is to tear down walls and build a flight simulator. And again, it's not as bad as it looks because it can be a shared experience like the old days of television. Again, VR is so fresh and new, and there's so much attention and money flowing right now that might be, for this community, an interesting way into the tech community, possibly, hopefully, using art as a flying wedge in and using the urgency of cultural extinction and cultural preservation as a common ground. Thank you.
Michael, just to make sure we're all on the same page, when you tapped into that concern about cultural extinction and preservation, tell us a bit about exactly what you were referring to.
The proviso is that, as an American, I might have a different view than others, but the mentor on this, the ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax, who died about 10 years ago, and I had the privilege of working with him, was not only fearful of losing the song, the dance, the cooking recipes, the painting and whatnot, performance from village life as urbanization happens, but was even more concerned that the young people from the villages, take China, moving to large urban areas, don't realize how valuable that stuff is to us. And he was concerned about how can we convince them, that the urge to be part of the global pop culture and, no Lady Gaga and use Snapchat and stuff like that is so overwhelming that the default state is where so many people coming, and again, I'm speaking a little bit as an American, might not appreciate how that the loss would be ours, and that therefore I think it's a healthy conversation to have. There's no, it's almost not like ethical or economic as much as just common sense, that it's you have something that would be good for us, and I hope you realize that, and I'd like to help you do that.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a good point to bring in Sarah, because you said you were going to do some philosophizing as well.
So I hope you'll forgive me philosophizing so late in the day. Thank you, Warren. To understand the future of cultural institutions, I'm going to build on my talk of yesterday with this philosophical disposition. I'm also re-engaging with a theme from the Cultural Collisions conference, which was held at Melbourne University, and it was called New Materialities or New Materialism. I think a discussion of so-called digital materiality usefully releases us from many of the conundrums that we face in renegotiating the role of digital in museums and in society today. I hope I'll be able to frame a way of us to think about the question and transcend this question of will museums be replaced by virtual museums. New materialism is an emerging trend in the 21st century which emphasizes the primacy of matter and its properties and actions. It responds to the need for novel accounts of agency, nature, and the social relationships, addressing the questions of how we produce, reproduce, and consume our material and digital environments. New materialism is reworking our long-held assumptions about the nature of things in the universe and necessarily the things of museums. The so-called material turn has been in part provoked by a frustration on the emphasis of texts and discursive constructions of culture, coupled with the primacy of the subject, both of which diminish the formative power of material environments. New materialism extends an ongoing deconstruction of the human nature binary and opens up a mobile space that acknowledges the often unpredictable and unwanted actions of human bodies, non-digital actors, ecological systems, even chemical agents. And this is all coupled to a very big history. This post-human entanglement is well illustrated by recent advances in biotech, engineering, and computer science that transforms digital data into synthetic DNA, which can then in turn be retrieved to reconstruct the original. A digital biological fusion, which will initiate a radical shift in archival practices in museums and the transmission of objects through time and space. It's predicted that all the data center of the world will soon be able to be stored in a single suitcase. Does anybody know about this transformation that's going on in the audience? Great. Okay. It's a big one. New materialism also provides an account of material being that is dynamic, non-linear, and non-deterministic. And the provocations new materialism raises necessarily bookends any discussion of the digital and post-digital museum. And I've selected a few key words for this reframing of the physical and the digital. Aura. Walter Benjamin famously described the processes by which objects are archived in museums and taken out of circulation. A museum piece, he would say, is an object minus its aura. The art theorist Boris Groys posits digital imaging as quite the opposite of this. It ignores the object to preserve the aura. That is, it's an absent object with its metadata. Flow. Archiving physical objects in museums removes them from the transformations of material flow. When you put them in the museum, you remove them from that flow. Digitizing them, assigning them metadata, and linking them to other objects reintroduces them to the processes of flow in the here and now. Agency. New material technologies give us strategies for restoring and augmenting the agency of physical objects that find themselves dislocated from context and removed from the flow of things. New materiality is at the heart of discourses in embodiment, which occur through a series of transformations between material presence and various media formats. Mediation allows one to contemplate ways of transforming aspects of the material past, while at the same time bringing forth something of the locality, multiplicity, and materiality left behind by the conventional processes of documentation and inscription. Embodiment and immersion are central to museums. Museums, as we know, are already interfaces through which visitors enter and step inside our spectacle. It was the CEO of Intel, Brian Krasnick, who said in late 2014, "We're in the midst of a transformation from a world of screens and devices to a world of immersive experiences. We live in the age of experience." And this is a concept for a museum exhibition without objects. It's a 10 large-scale immersive systems. It's modeled into the touring hall of Museum Victoria. And it has 2 pieces of content per machine. Some of the works that you saw in my presentation yesterday. But it's a whole new vision of museum-going experiences that combines the aura of the digital with the re-emergence, or the desire of the re-emergence, of large-scale virtual reality. So many theorists would say that museums are no longer concerned with the display of objects, but the staging of events. What remains is the documentation of ephemeral events, installations, happenings, and interactive installations. This concept also relates to my interests in the performative and the potential for intangible heritage in the museum context. I spoke yesterday of the Kung Fu Archive and the series of exhibitions around this, the reworking of the digital archive as an agent of notation, corporeal, gestural, haptic writing, motion capture producing continuous topological models that allow us to understand the effective quality of movement. It's also a mediating technology operating within interactive, participatory, and immersive regimes. It's the way for us to read a motion capture data set is also in the performative, the reenactment of the gesture, as you see here. And I'm just going to introduce another project in documentation. This is of the intangible. It's a project based around concepts of the Chinese body, and it's a reenactment of Confucian rites. It's a collaborative exercise between the Tsinghua University and City University of Hong Kong and the Moon Shu Foundation. And it engages really extensive historical and archaeological research to recreate specific rituals that haven't been performed for hundreds of years. Confucian Li is a concept that covers the realms of aesthetics, ethics, and ideology, and it's also a technique of the body, a skill which is learnt and inscribed. And it's an example of aesthetics as politics. And here you see a whole range of documentation processes and the almost scientific approach that we're taking to the recreation of these rituals. It uses a range of interactive web-based interfaces and also installations in the articulation of every movement and gesture. This is from a recent archery shoot in a green screen type studio. Also from this project, these are Beijing opera performers, all trained in these particular rituals, and then it's reshot from multiple points of view. The processes of documentation of intangible heritage create synthetic links or prosthesis in embodied knowledge transmission. Through its interface, a space is created in which the digital can help sustain intangible heritage in spite of the theoretical difficulties we have associated with documenting ephemerality, codifying the tacit, and mediatizing the embodied. And just to finish my philosophizing for this afternoon, this is my favorite quote from an art historian and museum director, Donald Preziosi, which really for me expresses the abundance inherent for us in museums today. The museum is a theatre of anamorphic and autoscopic dramaturgy, a place in which it's not so easy to tell which is a spider and which is the web, which is the machinery and which the operator. It is a place at the centre of our world, our modernity, in the image of which those worlds continue to proliferate. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm quite struck by the idea of a museum without objects, which has the mission of staging events. It's quite fascinating. And I think this is a good point to bring in Debbie, because she's both an artist and a technologist. So you might be doing some of that staging of the events that Sarah talks about.
Yes, I'm going to speak for just a very short time, since I've actually just spoken the last hour, or so. I guess as an artist, I almost wish that more artists were kind of involved in things like seeing the bigger picture as well, in which art kind of exists in museums or in galleries. Though I also acknowledge that it's not strictly necessary for artists to see it that way. Personally, I never actually studied art. I actually trained under designers who themselves reject art's label instead. But I guess I'm quite an optimist in the sense that I think that art has this transformative power. And whereas I know that in design, sometimes there is this idea that you do things for the better, for bettering your life, or for the good of someone or some community or people. I mean, obviously I've said transformative, but I think that I think of it in terms of knowledge transmission as well, like art, dance, and performance, as you said, as kind of embodied knowledge. And I think you also mentioned something about artists being the agents of notation. And I always think of this idea of in which art also is a way of recording culture or histories as well. I think I was struck with how a lot of museums that I've visited, even they start with kind of drawing an object as a way of recording it. In the past, before people used photographs, it's always about drawing it, and maybe even from looking at one angle and then turning on the other. It might only show you maybe a few angles of an object, but at the same time, it is about that sensorial experience. You know that person is drawing that detail based on their experience of it, which is sometimes it expresses more than just a high resolution photograph can. It's something about that that connection with the kind of object that is ultimately the most important. Yeah. Where was I? I think the thing also that I take from having a design training is also that idea of testing, I guess, usability testing in a sense, in trying to see what is the best way to do something. And also, I guess in thinking of this testing, doing prototypes, it's also not about being afraid to, if the thing you make is not complete, it's not, it is more about that process more so than the final outcome. Yeah, that makes sense.
Debbie showed us earlier on when we were having a discussion, a little project she had done. Do you have it with you?
I think I have it over there.
It's a book that she compiled when she was 16.
It was actually a book that was written by lots of secondary school students. We're doing a project where all the students who were about 15 and 16 were paired with a mentor to write a paper. And I think at that point,
it was called Art and Technology, right?
Yes, it was called Art and Technology. I was showing you the book because we were talking about how much so all the children in Singapore at that point already had been connected with computers to the point that I had ended up doing a school project about the impact of IT in education. It's a bit,
Right.
Which is like a 5-year review of the impact of the draft master plan for IT in education.
So I think the point we were making there was that quite a long time ago we were already thinking about the interface between art and technology, and from that point, when was it, 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Actually, I think that was 1999.
Okay, so we've come quite a long way from there where the art and technology has sort of come together in real life. Debbie is using art to produce, technology to produce art. And Sarah was making the point that we're really in a post-digital world where this technology is all around us. It's not something extraneous to us. It's very much part of what we do, and we just have to learn how to use it for maximum effect. But let me now bring in someone who runs an art institution, an art establishment, the Esplanade in Singapore. Maybe you can give us your perspectives on how the digital is playing out in your space.
Yeah, I was just thinking how so much of what Sarah has shared as what she has termed philosophy is actually just very real. It's a day-to-day reality for artists. And artists throughout the ages have always used different media available to them to connect, to tell stories, to challenge engender dialogue, to ask ethical questions, moral questions. And the media have been their bodies. It has been the stage. It has been, the web. It has been video. It has always been a means for artists to tell stories. And I was just reflecting coming in here, a piece of work that was done in the 90s by, this was a Necessary Stage, and one of the first HIV sufferers to have come public, Penny Chu. And this was in the 90s, a theatre piece. We are talking today about live broadcasts, about video broadcasts, but in him using his body and exposing that to an audience, he had recorded it. It was a video performance. He had a live, at that point it was internet relay chat. I don't know how many of you remember IRC, but at that point he was already using IRC to have conversations with the wider public about what it means to have HIV. Today, another artist has reenacted that same work because of the video footage, broadcast live on FB, Facebook, but also in the theatre as a live space. So in some ways, artists have always, you don't need fancy technologies, it's analog or it's your body. Artists have always mapped their own physical bodies and understood how muscle have memories. Artists are always at the heart of that kind of conversation. But I think what struck me was it's still about telling stories. It's still about communities connecting. And as somebody who works in a cultural space, while we talk about the digital as a social space, what we do as a physical space and the relationships that we are helping to facilitate between artists and communities is very, very real. So the challenge that I think as a performing arts center, what we have today is how do we learn from artists in being creative and in using all kinds of strategies and methods to make our physical spaces even more real and even more engaging and immersive as a social space. So that's a question that my colleagues, I'm sure, at Esplanade always ask ourselves, so, do we need to live broadcast something before? Do we need to document the processes of making a piece of work and broadcast it on FB before? Do we need to do more live chats? These are all simple ways, and I don't think we can say we want to keep the digital out. Because, Warren, you had a question of whether it cannibalizes. I don't think it's even something we would consider. You just have to do it because it's your way of reaching out and making social, making conversations, reaching out and connecting with the communities that you're trying to talk to. And extending that kind of experience at the center. If people want to take photographs at your performance, that I think is something which many concert halls and theatres have to grapple with today. You can't say, don't take a photo. In fact, for some of us, we actively encourage that at the end of the show. There's a message that comes up during curtain call and say, please snap a photo and share. It raises all kinds of issues. There are theatres today who insist that you lock up your phone. So there are many schools of thought. But I think part of that is also realizing that the theatre and the concert hall, the Performing Arts Centre reflects those tensions in society and the many ways in which people have come to say, is my space sacred? Therefore, please silence your phone. And for some people, the sacredness is precisely because I can share the experience with my friends, who are not in here with me, or I can record it. I can make what my personal experience is something social. So I think as cultural institutions, there's a lot that we can learn from artists in reaching out and creating, making our spaces a lot more sites of social interaction. And I think technology or whatever is digital, post-digital, is really just a very natural extension of human behavior and social exchanges. I think the other thing that I think for us as cultural institutions, we are catching up and really catching up for performing arts in particular, very separate from museums, because I think documentation is very real to you. But in the area of performing arts, we are way, way behind. So even for a national institution like us, the Esplanade, we are sitting on tons of beta tapes. Things that are not readable. We have lots of recorded performances, very, very valuable. And so the conversation we are at right now as a Performing Arts Centre is we've got, performances of traditional arts over the last 10 years. Singapore artists from around Asia. It's a rich, rich resource, and we're trying to find ways in which how do we document, how do we archive, and how do we make that available. So it's still at a very sort of primary level of discussion. But I think the other thing that has come up also is we realize that we have to start that from the beginning rather than at the end, which is in our conversations with artists as we commission and we produce work with them, that becomes very much part of how we talk about commissioning. The documentation of that is right at the start of it. Helping audiences make sense of this huge archive. I think we also realize that in the case of the performing arts, we will need to start writing narratives or providing ways of access as well through the archive that we're sitting on. So the second issue, besides being a social space, I think is how do we, in the performing arts sphere, facilitate knowledge making? And we really have a lot to learn from the museum sector, I think. Yeah, that's it.
One of the things you mentioned earlier, Yvonne, and when we were discussing amongst ourselves, was the repurposing of content, because so much work goes into preparing for a performance. And you come, you see the performance, but you don't see the backstory of how much effort went into it. And you don't see the richness of the material behind it. And Sarah mentioned that museums and media organizations are quite good at taking content and repackaging it in a multitude of ways so that you get legs to that content over many, many occasions. And that's something I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I think maybe it was Sarah or Debbie who talked about it, but that term repurposing is also quite active at the Esplanade when we talk about creating material, because so much work goes into a 2-hour performance. You have, 12 months or 24 months. And we're sitting on tons of content. From the artist's perspective, we create lots of education kits. We write essays to accompany a performance. But we are really just catching up on how a lot of that material can be repurposed. And we're trying to open up that rich resource that we have. Yeah,
Okay.
but performing arts is really catching up, I think. We're way behind.
Okay, let's bring in Kirk Siam to the discussion.
Okay. I think a lot has been shared at the conference, so I thought I would just make some observations and also personal reflections of the conference. I think just building on what Sarah and Warren you're talking about, and that we are now in the sort of post-digital age, and it's kind of really true if you look at what the speakers have been presented, that at least for the culture and heritage sector, you see technology and digital being embedded in many of the ways and across the whole value chain, from the way we document buildings and even intangible cultural heritage, to the way we manage and archive content, to the creation of art, and down to the stage where you share the information with the public through digital means, and how digital has been a platform to enhance the experience. So it's really showed that how it's really become part and parcel of the work that we do as cultural institutions. So that's my observations. And then I thought about reflecting on some of the presentations that have been shared, the discussions that have been going on so far. And I'll just share some personal thoughts about it. And that the first one I would like to talk about is really how technology has sort of empowered the individual to take charge of heritage and culture. Because if you look at how technology, social media has now enabled the individual to quickly share information, share archival images, blog about their experiences, talk about history and heritage of a place. It really has sort of empowered the individual. So the power is not just in the experts, the curators, the historians, but it's brought power to the people. And that's a very fascinating an aspect that technology has enabled us to achieve. It's kind of become a more even, equal sort of level playing field. But I guess I'm also reflecting on what's the downside, the dark side of this individual power. And there was some talk about fake news and misinformation. And I guess when I reflect on it, it could happen to a lot of the work that we do as well, because when you have people sharing information, whether it's malicious or maybe it's just a mistake, but when you perpetuate information, could that information become perceived as a truth? And then could that be a problem? Misinformation or inaccuracies that arise. I think some of these were some of the questions that were also raised yesterday at a panel discussion when the National Archives were talking about involving citizens in archiving some of the projects. So there could be issues related to this. The second kind of issue that I would like to just raise for maybe further discussion is that we now experience a lot of information and this kind of information overload, which then makes me ponder, what does it mean for us working in the culture and heritage sector? It also translates to this competition for attention, because there's so much information out there. Individuals are sharing information. In the digital age, attention span is short. We have to look at ways on how we can capture the attention amidst this era of information. And I think it actually translates to actually greater importance for the experts. The scale of how do you sort of curate, how do you make sense of this body of information that's out there, and that actually brings value to the experts' work in that sense. My second reflection and thought was that there's a lot of talk about technologies being disruptive technologies, changing the way that we work. We've observed these kind of technologies in many of the sectors. I think Warren will be familiar in the media sector, that's how it's changed. And we see it happening in the transport sector. Many people use Grab, Uber, and how it has challenged the status quo. I mean, would that also challenge how and also change the way we work. There was talk about whether institutions will be eroded. Could the digital media cannibalize on visitorship to the museums, visiting to the monument sites, for example? And my personal take is actually they are complementary in nature. Having more digital information out there may not necessarily cannibalize or affect people's attention and wish to visit a place. So I think maybe I'll share a personal thought. And 5 years ago, I think I visited the Taj Mahal. And before I visited it, obviously you've seen like tons of images on TV, on the internet, everywhere about the building. But nothing beats seeing the real thing, because it's not just the building and the history, but the full experience that you gain from being at the same spot, looking at the site, the people around you, the sense of space that you connect with. So it's really not just the visual or the senses that you get from the digital, but a lot of the work that we do is more experiential in nature, which cannot be fully replicated by digital technologies. So rather than viewing digital as a sort of competition, it's maybe a way of, it serves as maybe a trailer or a teaser to encourage people to really see the real thing. And maybe that can encourage, in fact, and bring about more people to enjoy culture and heritage. So that's the sort of 2 points I would like to share.
So you don't suffer any existentialist angst over cultural preservation. I mean, in Singapore, heritage issues are hip and cool, and young people are interested in it. So, and they are using social media to sort of connect and form their own network. That must be a good thing, isn't it? But how do you deal with the enthusiasm? Someone is interested, he starts to write about it, he starts to blog about it, and then inadvertently, introduces misinformation or errors about some artifact or some historical fact. How do you deal with that? I mean, you mentioned fake news, which is a very live issue in my part of the world, but it plays out in your space as well.
Yeah, I guess a lot of it has to do with conversations between organizations, institutions, and even conversation among the members of the community as well. And I think Eric yesterday was sharing that, for example, the Citizen Archivist project, right? How individuals provide check and balance to each other's work. So there could be critique on each other, and that check and balance, I think, is important in this age where you have many sort of digital communities form and how they interact, and that provides, and the conversation that takes place between the individual actors becomes more and more important in this day and age. How do we build that network and of communication and trust among the people, and how do we facilitate that discussion among the different players? I think that becomes more and more important.
Tell you a funny story. Last Saturday, as I was editing a feature on fake news, I got a flash across my computer screen saying, someone has just doctored the Straits Times Facebook page to say that President Tony Tan has visited Thailand and invited the new Thai king to come to Singapore to eat KFC. And I thought, do I even want to deny this ridiculous statement? But that shows you how easy it is to go in there and engage. It's both a boon and a bane. I think mostly a boon, but we just have to get quite used to it and get savvy in terms of dealing with this downside when it comes up. I'd really like to get the audience involved in this because it should be a conversation. So I see a hand. I'm going to go straight to that lady over there. Let's get a mic to her, and we can open it up to questions. And please tell us where you're from. Yeah,
my name is Rosie Wee. I'm a docent trained by Friends of the Museum. I guide in Sun Yat-sen Nanyang Memorial. I guide in this iconic building, National Museum of Singapore. And I guide in the National Gallery. Some people think I have nothing better to do.
I can't think of anything else better to do, actually.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is these 2 days I get to hear a lot of hype about the amazing things technology can do, especially to museums in particular. But my take is technology cannot replace a live tour by a docent. Why do I say this? Just imagine this scenario. An elderly lady walks into the museum. He looks at the artifact. He looks at the panel text. He squints his eyes, and he's none the wiser. Why? Because the font is so small and it's so very brief. And so he ends up a headache, and he walks out of the museum after looking at a number of artifacts. The other alternative he can do is to take an audio companion and walks around, and he hears a boring voice from somewhere from cyber, and he walks around and he hears, and that's about it. So both activities are solitary. Nothing beats a live guide telling him the story behind the artifacts, breathing life into the artifacts. Let's take this example, all right? Currently, there's this exhibition in National Gallery, Law of the Land. And if a person walks in without a guided tour or without following a guided tour, he sees 23 documents. Each document tells a defining moment in the history of Singapore, the legal history of Singapore. He squints his eyes, he reads the text, which is a faded and 100 years old document. And what I meant is, if he were to follow a live tour, a guided tour by a docent, the docent will be able to tell him the story behind that document, the plot, the high drama that took place, the players behind the final implementation of that document, which a person without a guided tour will not be able to have access to this. So the question I'm saying now is, how relevant or how desirable will docents be in the future? Are they going to end up as dinosaurs, endangered species? Now that we have this amazing technology, digital, and what have you coming in to replace docents?
Let me get Sarah to respond to that question. But first, let me ask you, what would your auntie with the headache think of an exhibition without any objects?
Oh yes, you need the objects, but you need a guided tour. Nothing can beat a guided tour. That's the point I'm trying to say.
Okay, Sarah, you want to respond to that?
So in many of the installations that we're building, so I'm thinking of the Dung Wang Caves and the 360 system, we run that as a docent-led tour. So the docent is absolutely fundamental to that experience. And that fantasy of a totally digital exhibition, touring exhibition, is filled with docents.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just let me conclude. Many of you have heard of this, there's no free lunch, right? And I agree. So organizations fly in people like Stephen Covey to talk about 7 habits of effective people and pay the sky for him. We docents do it for free. We are not paid, you see? So if you don't keep us, you lose us.
We certainly don't want that to happen. Let's have another question from the lady in front here.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question. I just want to react on the point.
Go ahead.
Because I'm sorry, but I totally cannot agree on this subject. Because we have to deal with several types of visitors. There's not just one visitor coming to our museums. There's not just one person who will always like a guided tour. There are persons who want to be alone, who want to reflect on life in a museum, or they just want to look at one object, or they want to have fun in a museum. So, of course, guided tours are important, but they're not the main thing. Sorry.
Thank you. I think that's an important point to make. You have a diverse audience, and you need to engage them in different ways.
You need to facilitate for anyone. So you need to have all the different forms, and digital is one form. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Or does the panel want to jump in at any point? Yeah. Honor, please go ahead. Let's have a question from my old friend Honor.
Thank you. I just wanted to say we do pay our docents, But that wasn't my question. It's Anna from Art Science Museum. I wanted to pick up on this fascinating thread that actually everybody in some way kind of shared, but Sarah, you pulled it out most directly, which is this sort of re-emergence of, materialism and embodied experience. And I was, I think, particularly kind of inspired by what you were sharing, Yvonne, when you were reflecting on the necessary stage kind of work. And it sort of, I guess, reminded me of some conversations that some of us have been having throughout the last few days about the challenge, actually, that we as museums and kind of gallery people are faced by the new art form of immersive theatre and participatory theatre, which has set the bar so high for, kind of immersive, embodied experience, and itself has been inspired by the kind of, game-like experiences that we saw in Michael's presentation yesterday. So I just wonder, kind of if anyone is able to kind of comment on, kind of what dialogues we can, kind of create between, kind of theatrical kind of communities working with that type of practice and those of us who are working in, kind of building-based environments.
I guess, sure, I'll start. Firstly, despite showing the Simpsons slide and talking about virtual reality, I am a public space immersion junkie, as you know, and see it at the end of the day as being symbiotic, whether it's performative or museum-based. And on one very simple level, the question is how to get people out of their homes into an experience with other real people. And that will, I think, be a cat and mouse game between whatever can be offered in the home. The museums have to do something better, richer, however you want to put it. And that, to me, is kind of an exciting proposition.
Yvonne, did you want to jump in? No?
Even in the space of immersive theatre, I'm sort of walking in here and chatting to my colleague on it, and she's like, what immersive theatre? It's like a dream, because the resources required to create immersive theatre is huge. I don't think any of our theatre companies, well, we recently have one very small scale, a kind of a murder mystery immersive theatre. But immersive theatre has always existed in some form. I mean, all theatre is immersive in that it requires you as spectator to engage critically in it. So I think the dynamics between us programmers, curators, producers is back to what Sarah has said, has become even more real, the experience. It's just that I think audiences today want to be part of that conversation, even more so. On the other extreme of immersive theatre is the theatre of one. And we also have lots of artists today who are focused on creating work for one audience in a small space. But I think they're both symptomatic of our human desire to connect, even more so than before. So the digital space merely accentuates that desire to connect digitally or physically. The challenge for us as cultural institutions, rightly as what Michael has pointed out, is how do we get people out of their homes? Because the live performance, that live experience can never be replaced. And it's a shared and often a communal experience. And that's why people think of the theatre space as somewhat sacred. And all theatre goes back to a religious ceremony in some ways.
I mean, that example you cited, Sarah, of the Confucian practices, yes. I mean, that seemed to be something which was quite immersive and taking rich content and bringing it alive for people in a very sort of highly interactive way. I mean, you're interacting with the content, you're viewing it. That would get people out of the door, I would imagine.
It's the contemporary art of the future, actually. It's been described as that. Any of these documentation projects that we're doing, it's about the way in which we re-embody that material into interactive systems, often at scale, so at one-to-one scale with the body. So everything is at life size, and we do a lot of things that are at life size. caves at 1-to-1 scale, Dongwang caves, which you wouldn't have seen yesterday. So, and going back to Anna's point, it's this idea of the museum as an immersive theatre, I think, and how we can really activate that, and how everybody that comes in the door becomes a participant in something, and how you manifest that and draw that out, focus on that. And that's where digital technologies have led a way, the interactive system, but it's much broader than that, understanding the museum as an immersive theatre.
Yeah, I guess the term that comes to mind is this idea of the suspension of disbelief, that people want to believe that it. I mean, I don't think that technology kind of phases out the humans, in the equation. Rather that sometimes there is a feeling, that the question always arises whether we use it as a stand-in for the actual human connection. But of course, it cannot replace it at all. But what we do want, and sometimes we use through technology, is achieving that almost hyper-real, more real than like your expanded views, in your work, Michael. That being able to see almost a more real than real kind of experience. I actually almost wanted earlier when I think you were saying about the I think you mentioned something about the real thing, the importance of the real thing. And I want to share a story about the Pulau Saigon project that I was doing. It actually began because I was showing a museum, an art science museum actually, and when I showed an interactive there was a small exhibit of actual museum artifacts from Pulau Saigon that I'd never seen in my life before. And I remember the space being really massive, and the work was really tiny. It was like it was like in a tiny cabinet, and the items were and the hall was massive. And there was this, for me, seeing that the tininess of the historical artifact made me want to make it more real than real, in a sense, to actually have it as something almost bigger than its physical form of being about this big, yeah. Which I think that through technology, even though I know it's not the real thing, by showing something that has, as artists, that I have the room to actually reinterpret it, not as a historian or as an archaeologist, but to kind of reinterpret it as something else, and using technology to kind of reproduce object that people will look and say, this is nothing like the real thing, but at least it gets them thinking about what was this original site, what was the history of it,
I'm thinking about a real-life example because last night, Rosa and I attended the book launch for a new book on E.W. Barker. And someone was reading a passage from it where they were describing the process in which he drafted the legal documents that gave rise to Singapore's independence. If you think about it, this is like the drafting of the US Constitution. And I think that young people would be interested in it if you could bring that whole process of life. If you could somehow give them an immersive experience of what it was like for this man to sit down for 10 days in the sweltering heat to craft this document all by himself, knowing full well that it was going to chart the destiny of his country. And that would bring history alive and would get young people through the door and get them interested. So how would you do that as an artist and technologist?
An interesting thing that I always find
live commission here.
That audiences on Facebook often say they will come to something, but they just press the interested or going button, but they don't actually go. It's almost like but I mean the thing is, of course, that they know that it exists, and that if they are interested enough to have made that connection, even if a virtual one doesn't bring them right now to the physical site, because I always find people, they read things, instead of going to exhibitions sometimes.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Hi, Eileen from the Science Centre. It's been a wonderful 2 days, and just to learn about a field that's really not my own, really not experienced in the arts at all. In the last 2 days, you guys have talked a lot about existing technologies like immersive spaces, data analytics. these are technologies that exist today, and it looks like a lot of cultural institutions are now making use of it in very creative ways. That's pretty cool. I would like to hear what the panel thinks about new technologies like, say, artificial intelligence. Would that be able to replace a docent, for example? Now, I mean, you see that it's getting cleverer and cleverer. That would be one. There was this story about some guy who died, and his girlfriend took all his messages, his emails, and created a chatbot that was so realistic. It's online somewhere. You can read it. It really freaks people out when you see this guy or this chatbot responding. Would that be able to replace a docent, or even, say we feed in political speeches, Facebook posts by politicians, and would that come out with a digital facsimile of somebody you could interact with in the future?
Yeah, I'd like to start just with the reference to the chat box of the deceased husband. Excuse me. It's a show of hands. How many people have seen a UK Channel 4 series called Black Mirror? Yeah, okay. It's on Netflix, probably here. It's 5 shows, and I'll warn you now, that's maybe the least disturbing of the 5 shows. And they're very, very well thought out. So, that's a way of sort of leading into how important these questions are to have a public discourse about. And, it's so easy for these very large companies that are mostly engineering driven that every time there's a knob that's on 6, you turn it up to 7. That's just the way it goes, without any questioning about it, without any larger cultural views. So, the vehicles to allow more input and more cultural views, I think, is really important, and also a very important role of the arts.
No, I completely agree, Michael. I mean, the artists or the script writers, artists can imagine these situations. So they take what artificial intelligence may be terribly exciting for engineers, but they can foresee all kinds of ethical, moral, or even positive situations out of that. But that's the role of the artist. One thing I think that some of us struggle with in the cultural sector is, while artists could possibly contribute to the conversations of engineers and the science community, how is it that big corporations can contribute to the conversations within the cultural sector? And that's where we are trapped in. Most of us have limited marketing budgets, limited resources in employing some of these technologies. I'm sure many of these projects are funded through universities, which are probably more well endowed. But many of our cultural institutions don't have access to some of these resources to take the precious content that we have and share that with the larger public.
Might I add, actually, because I've actually made scripts that were kind of like producing text that looks like my text but isn't me, actually. And it's not, a lot of the technology is maybe just not distributed to everyone, but a lot of this is open source. You find that even a simple Markov generator will produce a text that people want to believe is real. I think there are also lots of, the example of Eliza, I know it was a chatbot that wasn't really, it was not even AI in that sense, right? It was just a bot that people could speak to, and it just reflected the questions back. Like if you asked, there was this, where was Eliza built?
Yeah, let me dive in, because this is actually an interesting historical moment. Eliza was built, I think, in the 60s or 70s by a guy named Joseph Weissenbaum. I think I'm getting the first name right. And it was text only, and it was a therapist AI that you typed in. It said, "Hello, how are you? What's your name? My name is Michael. How are you? I have a problem. Tell me more." It was so basic. And what Weizenbaum found was how addicted people got to it, even though they knew what was going on, that he literally spent the rest of his life writing books about the dangers that the gentleman that you pointed out over here.
I think, in fact, the questions were the way it responded was so simple. Basically said, I feel sad. Why is it that you feel sad? It just basically asked the question back again to you. And even though they told everyone in the experiment that it was being recorded, it was not real, people talked to it like it was real, and later got angry that it was being recorded, basically, because it was the privacy thing. So it was I think it's also about how little of the technology is required to inspire this desire for it to be absolutely real. It's quite amazing. And I think that also over time, like I think it's been mentioned by other speakers in the earlier panels, that the cost of the technologies have come down so much as well that it is also within the reach. I'm actually not trained in, well, I didn't study programming or anything, but I do work with a lot of programming, and a lot of it's accessible to someone even who considers themselves from outside, looking inwards. Yeah.
At the World Economic Forum now, they talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and this is major disruption in all industries, where cars are driving themselves, where huge numbers of workers are displaced, huge amount of leisure time, lots of time to go to museums, of course.
Or be docents.
And be docents, yeah. But it is really, really thought-provoking question to imagine the fourth industrial revolution inside a museum. What does that look like?
Did you have other examples of cutting-edge technologies that the gentleman was asking for?
Robotics in general is really interesting, but most roboticists would say they will never replace human acumen. Yeah, so that's for sure. I think in terms of deep learning, there's a really, really interesting space for museum collections. So the automatic analysis of all video files and that kind of thing, and being able to link across mass distributed data and extract things from that. And it's the creative reuse of that material that's interesting. It's not simply the ability to mine it. So data mining, computer vision, deep learning, these are all interesting areas, open link data.
Maybe just to add to the conversation about the AI, I read in the Straits Times recently that...
So that must be true.
Yeah. That in Japan they started this hotel, and there was a picture of 3 receptionists and three different robots. And basically a robot served as replace humans in that situation. And I think it's partly because of the Japanese aging population and lack of manpower and also high costs that's driven these industries to adapt in that direction. And so my response to that is, why not? Why can't robots maybe in the future be taking on certain roles? It could be possible. I think it's really starting.
Dangerous activities. Yeah. It's very.
But I guess it's also if we are going to be faced with, say, an aging population, lack of people, we may have to be prepared for a scenario where they may assume some functional roles. They may not be fully replacing the human being, but certain functional roles may have to be taken up by such AI possibilities.
But
and then we'll all die, and they'll rule the world.
No, but in the fourth industrial revolution that the World Economic Forum is talking about, we'll all have less work to do and a lot more time to fill up. So, you won't need these robots to be doing all these things. You'll have to find things for us to do. So it's a completely different way of looking at it, I think. We don't want to upset Rosie, so docents will still have a role. Don't worry. Any last question? I'll take one last question from the gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Oh, Ashley.
Go ahead, since you have the mic, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, Joshua. Just to build on the point on AI, I think we would be dreaming to think that AI cannot take most of the jobs. The question which I like to put is, as you move into digital, where do you find the area where going to the hyperreal and leaving your ground to a reality? As you embrace, where do we know where it stands? And then the second is then, where can we use the museums, institutions, and artists to explore that relationship between man and technology? What is the role of the human versus the AI? The cultural institutions are a safe space where we can embrace this, and that's the time to bring in the technology firms, who they themselves are not able to articulate this because of their own limitations. And I'm just proposing that as an idea of where does a hyperreal go, and then where do you find a human and digital technological ground?
Okay, hold that thought. Let's get the question from the gentleman at the back, and then we can wrap up since we are rapidly running out of time.
Thank you. I'm Thomas from the Centre for the Arts at NUS. A simple question, given we've got heads of so many important cultural institutions here, how will you know if you've successfully negotiated the digital age?
Okay, so the role of the human and how will you know you've succeeded. Let's get answers from Kok Siang down, and then we'll end up with Michael and wrap up there. Kok Siang, can you jump in?
Maybe I'll address the question about how do we know we have succeeded in the digital realm. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues yesterday, and his thoughts actually was that maybe we will need to find ways to measure maybe what success in the digital realm means, because it's going to be very different from. It could be very different from what conventionally we know of. So if you take a look at, I guess, museums and going digital, does the digital success translates to visitorship and physical bodies? Maybe, maybe not. Because yesterday there was also a presentation, I think, was it the Rights Museum? They used the term culture snacker. And you mentioned that it could be people who just snack on bits of information and maybe not even visit the museum. So that could be success at a certain level, because you're reaching out to people who would not otherwise be exposed to the arts and culture. So there could be success in different ways, and we have to maybe look at how we frame success in the digital realm, and it could be very, very different from what we conventionally know of.
Yvonne?
Maybe the first one on just using again another performance. Just last year, Esme had a performance where a Taiwanese choreographer danced together with a robotic arm, and he had spent years kind of programming, training that robotic, really beautiful dance. What did we take away from that performance? Was it his skill and his choreography? But I think for most audiences who saw it, beyond the initial, wow, you could do that, and how beautiful that looked, and that, you know, something so metallic can be so graceful. Beyond that, I think eventually what most people took away was his story and how lonely he was. And he was reflecting on his own childhood and why he had always desired to have, you know, a friend. And I think that was the main thing. So in some ways, the arts always bring us back to that point about our own human existence, understanding of ourselves. And I think as an art center, we always go back to that, which is how does the arts transform society? How do we build communities? Digital, post-digital, these are all tools that are available to us as an art center. Our mission doesn't change. So if you were to ask me then, the next question of how do we measure success, it still goes back to, at the heart of it, as a cultural institution, our mission is to transform as much part of the lives of Singaporeans as possible through the arts. You know, make it better, raise the quality of living, have communities feel more proud of who they are, communities understand their own heritage, and we will continue to measure it that way. In these kinds of intangibles versus pure visitorship, or even how many people have gone through our website, how many have accessed our digital resources. These are all proxies, I think, to ultimately the impact we have on society. Yeah.
Let me. Okay, Sarah.
You could think that I would say we'll never mention digital again. Then we've succeeded. I think at a very practical level inside cultural organizations, and I mentioned this yesterday, having curatorial and directors who have a fundamental understanding of technologies and how they operate and what their power is will be hugely transformative in museum domain or in the cultural organization. So that's what I would say. When we have those, we will be in a better state.
Two quick, well, one quicker than the other. The first quick comment is regarding AI hyperreal in museums. A recurring theme here, just to channel a little bit, is how museums is like a magic circle or a special place. And, you know, it's funny because we often associate movies with that role of getting lost. You go there, you're taken on a trip. And maybe museums have to become a little more like that, where the incentive to go and just be totally like lost and do something you can't do at home and very special. Regarding the metric for success, a friend of mine up until recently was a founding director of the largest individual funding agency for the arts in the United States. It's called Creative Capital. It's an aggregate of most of the other large foundations. And we got together the evening after Harvard Business School released their first case study of this, and the first as an arts agency. And she had just fielded 2 classes of MBA students, Harvard MBA students. And she said that was the question that came up again and again and again. How do you measure the metric for success? And she didn't know how to answer it. And that was several years ago, and they've put a lot of work into that. So that's a challenge for you, and us artists are not very good at that. So you know, how to do it in a way that's not, you know, like 6 out of 7 people like toothpaste, you know, comes across a little better. It's a hard question, but it's a very important question for funding, for dealing with corporations, and for general public perception.
Okay, I think that's a good point, good to wrap up our discussion. I like Yvonne's point about these measures being proxies for the wider goal of building stronger communities, because I think ultimately that's what it's all about, really. And if you get too fixated on just the raw numbers, then you've really missed the picture. So I found the discussion absolutely fascinating. I'm glad I came. Please join me in thanking the panel for a wonderful session. Thank you.